All right. Camera's off and running, which means time to study. And what is oops? Oops is our word to start with. All right. What do we say oops for? What does oops mean? Made a mistake, right? I did something wrong. And then what? In Judaism, if you do something wrong, what happens? Right? You do something wrong, you have a permanent stain upon your soul which can never be expunged. No, I don't see a lot of love.
No, that's not.
No, that doesn't sound like us, right? You do something wrong, we try to make it right. All right, we fix it. So let's say it's something that is unrecoverable. So we'll use a very sort of minor example. You sit down to eat, and you get up to get something. You come back, you take a bite from your sandwich, and you notice that while you were gone, a lizard crawled into it. Yum!
Happens all the time.
Right? Happens, we're in Florida, right? The lizards love to come in the houses, and then they can't get out. So they took a nice nap in your sandwich. Obviously, eating lizard is not kosher, so don't anyone get any ideas. Oops, I've eaten something that's treif. Honest mistake. Okay, so am I in trouble? No, it's an honest mistake. It's bishgaga. It was an accidental transgression, and there are still ways to fix that accidental transgressions. That you would still admit that you did something that wasn't right, even though it was not your intention to do so. And in something like this, in the ancient world, there would have been a little sacrifice that went along with it, but it would be handled fine. If you do something bigger, you say something to a person and it wasn't your intention, but as soon as it comes out of your mouth, you realize that's going to sound like an insult. What then? I'll give you an example. I was staying up late at night at college once with someone when I was in England, and we were all talking and hanging around the common room table, and he said, "Oh yeah, well actually I'm 27," and I said in my youthful naivete and stupidity, "Wow, 27! I imagine I'd always be married by then." And of course, I could see from his face that he took it not as the stupid reflections of a 20-year-old who was realizing that his own life was going by way too fast, but as a criticism of him for having not gotten his life, in quote, in order. And by the way, I did not get married when I was 27. I was only married when I was 28. So I was off schedule for myself too. What then? I've just insulted him inadvertently. Am I stuck with the guilt of that crime for all eternity?
Well, you sounds like correct that.
Yeah, so it sounds like I'm still carrying the guilt for that, yes. But the actual guilt that's carried, rather than my own self-reflection, rather than self-recrimination, we can ask for forgiveness, can apologize, and explain that wasn't at all what was intended or how it was meant, that it was just a clumsy expression, and that there was no insult implied. And we would hope the person would forgive us, Burma shave, as my grandfather would say, and we're done.
Burma shave?
Burma shave. Burma shave. I'll explain later. It's before your time.
No, it's not before my time. It's before your time.
Yes, but I listened to my grandfather, thank God.
I must be ancient and I remember very clearly.
Okay, well, I suppose it also depends on what part of the country. So, most everything in Judaism has a way to be fixed, has a way to be handled. What if you accidentally kill someone? Oops. Oops.
Really?
I
accidentally shoot down an airliner.
I didn't know the gun was loaded. Oops. Right? Oh, I thought the car was in park. Oops. I was just checking my texts. Oops. No? Not just oops?
I was just drunk operating a missile launcher.
Well, I mean, we can at least imagine that if someone made a choice to get drunk, that they should have been held responsible, but there are some legitimate oopses that happen that aren't even necessarily with regards to negligence. Right? If I'm, walking down the street and I bend over suddenly to tie my shoe, and the person behind me bumps into me, and they knock me into the street, and I get hit by a bus, are they really a murderer? Is that terrible? Should they never be allowed to be forgiven for their crime? Did they commit a crime? Well, that's what we're going to wrestle with in this parasha. So go ahead and open up to page 961. And we're going to be reading from chapter 35 of the book of Numbers, from Masei. (961), chapter 35, Bamidbar. All right. Volunteers,
Are you going to let me read sometime?
please.
Thank you. The Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes, right?
That's where we are.
The steppes. The Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, saying, instruct the Israelite people to assign out of the holdings apportioned to them towns for the Levites to dwell in. You shall also assign to the Levites pasture land around their towns. The towns shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture shall be for the cattle they own and all their other beasts. The town pasture that you are to assign to the Levites shall extend 1,000 cubits outside the town wall all around.
About 1,500 feet.
You shall measure off 2,000 cubits outside the town on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, 2,000 on the west side, and 2,000 on the north side, with the town in the center. That shall be the pasture for their town.
All right. Got this? We're doing zoning laws before Moses disappears and before the people go across the Jordan into the land proper. And the final instructions that we're getting here at the end of the book of Numbers, which is the last book of the Torah that is not a recapitulation, which is what the book of Devarim is. This is the final topic that is being dealt with. And we need to have these towns set aside for the Levites. And there are going to be 6 of these eventually. And you get the town in the middle, and you've got 1,500 cubits around it, and then out to 3,000 cubits around that. So this is your pasture, and this is kind of like your low buildings, you know, your storage buildings or whatnot, your sheds and other things that you might need. And this is the town itself. Make sense? That's what we just...
No, I thought they weren't supposed to have land. Kohanim and Levites.
They're not supposed to have land. So what's this?
So what's this? This doesn't make sense.
Well, that does make sense because you're going to see that these are dual-purpose zonings.
It's
The
like
ta-
government land or something, right?
Well, it's set aside, and the Levites are going to have this land as their inheritance. And we're not talking about exactly a giant allotment of land here. You know, it's all of 3,000 feet. Actually, I guess all told, it's going to be about 6,000 feet side to side. We're only talking about a square mile, a little bit more than a square mile.
But they're going to have their own cattle. I thought they were eating from the sacrifices of the temple.
Kohanim.
But not the Levites.
These are the Levites. Well, the Levites do get a piece of the tithe, but they don't get the sacrificial parts. So,
This is
well, we've only got a couple towns here. Again, we're not talking about decimating the massive amounts of allotments that are going to all the other tribes. Okay, but
God said this, remember?
right, but we're going to see that these towns are not just for the Levites. These towns are not just for the Levites. And that's our next paragraph. We're on verse 6.
The towns that you assign to the Levites shall comprise the 6 cities of refuge that you are to designate for a manslayer to flee to which you shall add 42 towns. Thus, the total of the towns that you assign to the Levites shall be 48 towns with their pasture. In assigning towns from the holdings of the Israelites, take more from the larger groups and less from the smaller, so that each assigns towns to the Levites in proportion to the share it receives.
All right, so 6 of these towns are going to have this special purpose of being a city of refuge, a city where somebody that is a manslayer. And we're going to deal into this in just a minute, so hold your questions on what counts as a manslayer. Will be able to flee to after their act. So hold on to that. That's where we're going to focus. Keep going, Randall?
We don't have it like this in Israel today.
No. They're because
We have to have the temple before we can have this.
Yes. And we're going to talk about why that is as we go through.
Okay.
Oh, hold on a second. Another question?
In this one here,
Yep.
it says that it has to be, that the town has to be in the exact center.
Oh, you mean of the
Yeah,
perimeters? Yes. Well,
the exact center.
well, and that's what they said about 2,000 this way, 2,000 that way, 2,000 this way, 2,000 this way. That it should be equidistant. Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
The Lord spoke further to Moses. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall provide yourselves with places to serve you as cities of refuge, to which a manslayer who has killed a person unintentionally may flee.
Yeah, keep going.
The cities shall serve you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer may not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly.
All right. So, first of all, what do we get here? We get three really important concepts that need to be unpacked and unraveled, and many of our texts that we're going to look at will do that. So we have the cities of refuge, and who goes to them?
The guy who
A
shot down the
manslayer.
airliner.
Well, someone who did it unintentionally. I think pointing at an airliner and pulling the trigger on a rocket launcher doesn't quite count as unintentionally.
But he still needs a trial.
Well, and we also get the fact that there needs to be a trial. So we get the idea that there's an unintentional death caused, and the person who caused the unintentional death is going to need a trial. And we get another character here. Well, the assembly that's doing the trial, absolutely, which is one of the reasons why without the temple or without the formal Sanhedrin, we don't have this, because we don't have the proper apparatus to do that trial. And an avenger, right? It's not just the comic book series. The avenger. We've got the idea here that there is somebody who is seeking vengeance for the death of his loved one.
But it's sanctioned.
Well, is it or isn't it?
I've had that impression over the years.
So there is a notion that indeed we would not be surprised and we cannot condemn after the fact that someone has taken vengeance in the passion of their grief for the loss of a loved one, even in the case where it happened accidentally. But there needs to be a place for that person who caused it accidentally to go and hide, to seek refuge, so that the avenger won't kill them before a proper trial takes place. So there is this incredible balance being struck here between an acknowledgement of the passion of the moment of the individual and the needs of the society for rules of justice. And the cities of refuge is the focal point of this balance. That no, we couldn't imagine that if your neighbor killed your father while they were out chopping wood, that you would just say, oh, well, accidents happen. You would be furious and you would seek retribution. It would be your natural instinct. But we also can't imagine just letting the neighbor die and letting the cycle of violence continue, as then those who avenged him come to you and your family, and it goes on and on and on forever. And so these cities of refuge are set aside so that there can be a place for the person who has committed the involuntary killing to go and rest and hide until a proper trial can take place. And there's more to come about that.
The towns that you thus assign shall be 6 cities of refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there.
Right, so we've got our map of Israel, but now that we know that there are going to be some tribes living on this side of the Jordan, even though that was not part of the original plan, but that was what happened after our counterattack, we need to have cities over here too, as well as over here. Those are not exactly where the cities were, it's just demonstrating the equality of them. Because, God forbid, someone over here should commit unintentional murder and not be able to reach one of these cities, where they can then find refuge until a proper trial and case can be heard. So there have to be these cities where our people are living. And we also find out that even if you're not Jewish, you still have the right to the same justice that a Jewish person would have.
I think that's actually quite amazing, because we take for granted right now that if someone does a crime, whatever, we put him in jail, we hold him there, he's safe, he's guarded until such. They didn't have jails and prisons. They had
No.
dungeons where you killed somebody, but they didn't have the system we have now, which is a place for someone to await trial.
Correct. The idea of a modern prison system, even of a short-term jail, is a relatively new concept.
And even when it finally would have come to fruition that there'd be such a concept, we never owned a land that we could do it in somebody else's government. Jews couldn't set up jails in a Roman territory.
Well, yes and no. It's a little more complicated, but yeah, it wasn't exactly like that.
It wasn't
Yeah,
our government.
exactly. There was a weird
Yeah.
cooperation kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, but we got a lot more room to go.
Shall I ask Bob Dylan about this next time I see him? About who needs to get stoned? Oh, Bobby. He was my neighbor in Woodstock. I have to ask a question.
Yes.
Bob Dylan all aside. Zimmerman, Mr. Zimmerman. Do we know where these 6 cities are today?
There is strong evidence from the classical texts of where they likely were, but archaeology has not unearthed the town sign that says definitely right here this was it.
Okay, what about the mystery of that? I forget the name of it. Somebody will remind me and remind all of us that nearly miraculous city way in the middle of the desert in Jordan that you have to go through this
Oh,
narrow...
Petra. Petra. Yeah, that wasn't one of ours.
Are you sure?
Positive.
Yeah, it's not.
The Muslims I know say it was.
No, from everything I know, the Petra was developed in the current form long after Jews had been
Long after
dispersed.
this
Well,
time,
long after
of
this, and
course,
long
of
after
course,
we had
of
been
course, of
dispersed.
course.
Yeah,
But that doesn't mean it couldn't have been at the same place.
I've never heard of any claim that the two were connected.
The Muslims I know told me it was built by
We had
the
two
Jews. And that's not a bad thing to be blaming. It's not
Yeah,
just
it's a beautiful site, but yeah. But I don't think we can take credit for it. Oh,
The Arabs are famous for changing history.
well, like I said, I mean, in this case, it's in a sense to our credit, but yeah, I wouldn't rely on local traditions alone for the history of a place, because oftentimes people do kind of invent things for one reason or another.
You all may have covered this before I came in the room, but it says killing unintentionally. Who
Mhm.
makes that decision for these people to go there and wait in comfort?
That's what we're getting to.
Oh, okay.
And by the way, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that this is in comfort, right? We've got a 1 square mile area that you are technically allowed to stay in, and as far as comfort goes, we're going to get to who's feeding these people in our classical texts from the Mishnah and the Talmud. So it would not have been, "Ooh, look, I get to go here for vacation." And as we're going to see, even if it is found that they did commit this murder unintentionally, it was completely an accident, they're still stuck here for a lot longer than you might have expected. You know, in the modern prison system, modern jail system, if someone awaits trial and they are found not innocent, but they are found to have committed involuntary manslaughter, you know, the case like I gave you of the guy bends over to suddenly tie a shoe and the guy behind him bumps into him and boom, busts. The guy who bumped into him, if the details of the case are as I just gave you, most likely he's going to walk. He's not going to serve time for having accidentally caused the death of this person. Well, we are going to see a different rule in the Torah.
But he's still going to really feel like
Oh, absolutely.
For the rest of his life.
Absolutely. Any human being should feel horrible that they were involved in the loss of life of another person. But the criminal justice system would not hold them responsible. We are going to see some, well, the person is going to be stuck here for a long, long time. Well, give or take, we'll see.
Really? How long?
It's going to be...
Until a trial happens?
No, there's a variable that's going to be introduced, and I don't want to spoil the surprise.
Read?
Please read, yes, from verse 16.
Yes. Anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object so that death results is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. If he struck him with a stone tool that could cause death and death resulted, he is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. Similarly, if the object with which he struck him was a wooden tool that could cause death, and death resulted, he is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who shall put him to death upon encounter.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Could we get an extra
We're in the midst of
goulash?
something very heavy.
Yeah.
So too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter.
All right, so as Randall said, rather heavy stuff that we're going through here, but there's a lot of little details that we need to tease out, yes.
What if it were a self-defense issue?
Self-defense was already covered way back in the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and you are allowed to defend yourself against an attacker, no problem. So that definitely does not count as murder in the Torah.
Who is the blood avenger, though? Am I the blood avenger because a friend of mine was shot to death on the Maidan in Kiev?
No, the blood avenger was usually the immediate relative. The actual relative of the person.
What am I supposed to do?
You hopefully bring the person to justice and trial. And like I said, this is where
They were wearing ski masks.
that makes it tricky. That makes it extremely difficult.
What if there's a conflict between two people,
Mm-hmm.
one person murders the other, there are no witnesses. Then it has to go by only the person who killed the other person, say it was self-defense?
We have a videotape, but the killer.
No, I think she's saying in general. In general.
Ski
There were no
masks.
witnesses.
We have a videotape of the Hamas guys coming out of the tunnel too, but I don't think we can identify.
Hold on a second. Wait, whoa. Hold on. One person at a time, otherwise the rabbi gets confused.
It's war.
So
We're in war.
there are a couple of different categories. So yes, as Randall just mentioned, there are certain conditions of war and combat which this rule does not apply to. But that's not what the Torah is trying to deal with. The Torah has other sections that deal with how we behave during war. And as far as self-defense goes, yes, there are special rules which regard self-defense or the defense of another person who is under attack, but not in a war situation. This is dealing with just two people who begin, for whatever reason, to cause injury to one or the other. And the question is, how do you distinguish between whether it was murder or whether it was an unintentional injury?
And if you claim that you're a Christian or a Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that is, you say that you're still living by these laws,
Well, some do or some don't. I mean, that you know, I'm not here to work through all the complicated differences of different theologies.
Some don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Some do and some don't claim that the laws of Torah continue to apply to them. Some can believe that the laws of Torah merely inform different aspects of their living, but aren't necessarily considered to be legally binding the same way that Jewish people do.
Jesus, excuse me.
Yeah, well,
but
no,
Jesus said,
Randall.
Don't change one
We're not going to
little-
argue with their theology.
Word.
We are here to understand our own.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah,
Yes,
we're here to
okay,
understand
thank
our own.
God.
Okay, so it's complicated, but notice that the Torah begins to introduce a few of the elements that we'll need to unravel this. If you notice when we were reading through on 963 from verse 16 down, we got an iron object or a stone tool or a wooden tool, but there's some qualifications. Yes. Remember, close reading. Close reading. What?
Caused in it.
That could
And did
cause
death.
death. A stone tool that could cause death. A wood tool that could cause death. Right? If I poke someone with a toothpick and they drop over dead, I'm not considered a murderer. Because this is not something that could cause death. Therefore, I should not have realized that by poking him, it would cause death. Therefore,
Wait.
no one would presume that, now, if I poke him in the eye, yeah, we've got some different things. If I'm poking him in the jugular, we got some ideas. But in general, the Torah is trying to say that one of the ways we tell what the intention of the attacker was, or the inflictor of harm, let's be less pejorative, is by the implement that was used. So we're going to start off with one of our texts here, if you could pass those along, that deals with this. I'm going to have to, because we got to unpack this as we go, so we're getting out the handout before we're done with our Torah reading, but that means you have to promise me not to read ahead. Because remember, I want you to see the questions as they come up so that then we can look at how our tradition answers the questions. If you've already read the answer first, then you may not have ever had that wonderful, delightful tension of having a question.
Well, that's
And-
the beautiful thing about the Torah, because I think we have all read it many, many, many times already, but it still holds surprises.
Absolutely, and it always will. Okay,
Yeah.
Always will.
so because the language is a little nuanced, I want to go ahead and I'll take the liberty of reading this first text, because I want to make sure that we can follow the emphasis that the text is trying to give us. This is Rashi's interpretation based on the number of midrashim and sections in the Talmud, and he tries to summarize it for us. And so this is based on that verse 16, which talks about the iron implement, and then the whole list beneath it about the stone and the wood. And he notices, according to our tradition, that this does not refer to accidental manslaughter, discussed nearby, meaning the verse right above it, but to premeditated murder. That verse 16 isn't talking about just accidental death, we're now talking about intentional death. And it teaches us that the implement of murder has to be big enough to cause death. How do we know this? For regarding all the other cases, it says which is deadly, which the Targum, which is the classic Aramaic translation of the Torah, says, of a size capable of causing death. Right? So the phrase that's used here is that it's able to cause death, and he's saying that that's how the Aramaic gets translated as well. But if you notice in the verse 16, which talks about an iron implement, it doesn't have that codicil. It doesn't have that appended, which means, according to our tradition, it is evident and known to the Holy One, blessed be He, that even a small piece of iron can kill, even a needle. So there's no minimum measure of iron that's considered not deadly. Anything that is metallic can be used in the appropriate circumstances, or inappropriate as the case may be, to cause death. Whereas for the other ones, that's not true. And that is why the Torah did not specify a size or rite which is deadly with regards to the iron. Now, if you think that this section of the text is actually referring to one who murders unintentionally, then below, further on, right, when we get to verse 23 in a little while, it also says, or with any stone which is deadly, and without seeing his victim. Well, in that case, it's clearly talking about unintentional damage. And since we know the Torah never unnecessarily repeats itself, that means this section must be talking about intentional damage. Right, that's one of the basic axioms of rabbinic analysis, which is that the Torah never unintentionally repeats itself. So if it's going to say just 8 verses later that it's an unintentional damage with a stone that's capable of causing death, then this stone which is capable of causing death, and wood and iron, must be talking about a different type of damaging, and that's the intentional type of damaging. You're following that logic? I'm not asking you to agree with it. We always have room for debate, but I want to make sure that you understand why the rabbis are interpreting this section about the size of object to be intentional damaging. Make sense? Yes? No?
Of course.
Maybe? Okay.
Of course.
Okay. Very good. Now we can go back to the Torah. I just wanted to make sure we got that out of the way.
However,
Yes.
I have to interject. Everybody knows we live in an age in which it's possible to kill with extremely minute quantities of toxins.
Absolutely.
There's a plant that I see every time I walk here that I know, and I'm not going to teach anybody about.
Good. and absolutely right. And the Torah and the sages know.
The amount of that plant can kill.
Exactly, which is why the Torah and the
So
sages.
don't go eating things out of that creek, okay?
Right. Well, hold on. Which is why the Torah and the sages don't say 3 ounces, 4 pounds, or 5 foot. They give the measurement as capable of causing death. And if through human ingenuity we are able to find smaller and smaller quantities that can still cause death, then those become equal to premeditated murder if you use them against another person. And you can't just say, "Oh, but I thought it was just so small." If you're able to load a gun with a paperclip, well, it's metal. If you're able to load a gun with a toothpick and fire it so that the toothpick is now traveling at massive velocity, you can't say after you shot someone with it, "Oh, but I thought the toothpick wouldn't hurt him." No, you put it into a gun, you used it maliciously, you used it at deadly speed, you are therefore committing premeditated murder. It wasn't an oops moment when the toothpick went into your victim. Because but it was a toothpick. No, you were trying to kill, you did kill, you're going to have the consequences for that. Okay, verse 22. We are on page 964, verse 22. Randall, are you able to keep going?
Yes.
Please do.
Thank you. But if he pushed him without malice, aforethought, or hurled any object at him unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon him any deadly object of stone, and death resulted, though he was not an enemy of his and did not seek his harm, in such cases the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger.
Well, let's make sure we got that basic idea, right? There's no reason to believe there was malice or hate between these two people, and what was being done clearly seems to have originated through an accidental form, and especially our rabbis pointed out, like the idea that if something drops on a person, then that is a certainly understandable accidental act. Then the avenger doesn't get to just go crazy and kill the person. The avenger has to wait until there has been a full trial, even if he's able to catch him before he gets to the city of refuge. So the circumstances are meant to also cool the violence of the avenger. So the Torah is doing everything it can to take what was a common practice in the ancient world, and still common, unfortunately, in many parts of the world today, which is to have a relative of a victim of violent death seek immediate violent punishment against the person who caused the death of the relative, regardless of the circumstances. And the Torah is saying, no. There are circumstances, and then there are circumstances. And in some circumstances, we recognize that stopping you would be like stopping a freight train. But in other circumstances, we are going to try and put the brakes on. What's that?
Innocent until proven guilty.
Innocent until proven guilty, with this one little leftover of the laws of the wild, wild Middle East, of the wild, wild West. And we have seen that over time, that through interpretation and through judicial education of people, that most people now do not seek violent of vengeance for the loss of a loved one. In most countries where justice is the norm and justice is considered to be true and expected, most of us would not immediately think, if God forbid we lost a loved one to violent death, we wouldn't think to go kill the person who caused it. We would think, where are the police? Where's the courts? I want this person punished through the system of justice, not by my own hands. And that is the ultimate effect that Torah has brought to us. But they were dealing with a culture that still, the first instinct was, I want to kill them. And it was rolling it back already at that point. And thankfully we've gotten much further and able to control our desire for blood on our own hands to compensate for the death of a loved one. Make sense? Maybe? Okay.
Maybe.
Onward. Onward.
The assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled. And there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil.
Okay, we're going to leave it there because we've got a bunch of other texts I want to get to. But I want to make sure we understand that last little part. So how long, if you were up on the roof and you were putting a new brick in place, and the brick went whoop down below, and it hit somebody below, either it be a stranger or someone that you had no malice to, you'd never been fighting with, never would ever think you did it on purpose, how long do you have to stay in the city of refuge? Until there's a trial? No. The trial only proves that it's true you didn't do it on purpose. But you still did it. So you go back to the city after that trial. And how long do you stay there?
Until the high priest is
Until the high
charged.
priest dies.
But are you sentenced to that city, or is that your option?
Well, we do have in the next few verses that if you step foot out of that city, the blood avenger can still kill you.
So it's up to you.
Kind of, yes. We could make a whole TV series about that, of the fugitive, of someone hunting you to kill you. But yes, that is technically your choice. But certainly the law seems to be saying you did take this person's life, and therefore you will stay in the city until the high priest dies. And we're going to talk about what the high priest has to do with all of this when we get through a bit more. But this is a remarkable example of no oops. You don't get to say oops.
Oh, no.
No oops. I know it's not really good English, but like I said, in American law, I didn't mean to do anything. I was putting the brick on the top of my roof, and it slipped off. And the guy was walking underneath. There was no reason why he was there. Maybe I even had, the little safety cordon around it, everything right. And he got killed. I feel terrible about it, but I have to go live here because if I step out, someone could kill me and they wouldn't be called a murderer? What in the world? I mean, oops, man, oops, I'm sorry. No. You don't get to say oops when it comes to taking a life.
You better hope that the high priest isn't 30 years old.
and you want to hope for an aged high priest? We're going to get to the attitude of the condemned to the high priest on the other side. Don't turn the page. We're going to get to that attitude in just a minute. You are almost prophetic in your statement.
I think maybe you're going to tell me to wait. But once the high priest dies, then what is the option? Does
You're free. Free to go anywhere you
Free.
want, and the blood avenger, if they were to kill you, would be considered a murderer.
Okay, so he's no longer vulnerable.
Correct. Well, he's still physically vulnerable, but not legally vulnerable. The blood avenger may still do whatever he feels like, but he doesn't have any justification for doing so.
Because he waited till the high priest died.
Exactly.
Okay.
Is there any mention, by the way, of him getting 3 hots in a cot as long as he's in the city of refuge?
Actually, there is mention of what he's going to be eating. Yes.
There is obligation
Because
to take care of it.
again, remember, we're sitting here in this city of refuge. This is not my home. I don't have a farm here. I don't have my flocks here. I don't have my family here. And what am I supposed to eat? It's not a good position to be in. So we're going to talk about who feeds him and why when we get to the other side. But don't read ahead. Don't want to ruin the surprise.
But if he's there for 30 years,
Uh-huh.
can he not accumulate flocks and dig a garden?
From whom? This land belongs to the Levites. Maybe they would, choose to rent it to him or allow him to do it. That is an option. But there's no obligation. There's no easy mechanism for him to support himself while he's here. So yes, it's possible, and I'm sure that the person would do more than sit and stare at the walls, but not that easy for things to work. And that's going to be the conundrum that's going to be answered by our tradition on the back page. Don't peek. Okay, so I'm going to read this next section. You can see from Rashi, verse 30 on our handout. It points out that based on the testimony of witnesses, right? We didn't quite get to this, but it's just trying to remind us that even an intentional murderer, let alone an unintentional murder, everything has to have been witnessed for there to be a proper trial and ruling. And to go back, Andrea, to your question, well, what happens if there are no witnesses? Circumstantial evidence did allow our ancient judicial system to punish people, but it did not allow them to execute people. If there were not two witnesses to the crime who warned the person, et cetera, there's a whole list of specifications. They are not allowed to be executed. And our tradition goes so far to say that even if the entire Sanhedrin, the entire High Court, watched the person perpetrate the crime, another court would have to try them. The members of the Sanhedrin would be witnesses to that court, to that trial, but that person would still deserve a trial by people who had not witnessed the crime. Because if you witness the crime, you're unlikely to find reasons to exonerate them. And there has to be, in a Jewish trial, at least one person who is advocating for innocence on behalf of the person that's under trial. So we did go to great lengths to make sure that we did not execute anyone without incontrovertible physical testimonial evidence that they did commit the crime, and unbiased evidence that they committed the crime. Okay, so let's come back to this oops question. So this is what I found to be a really good analysis of how unusual this circumstance is in Jewish law, this not allowing of an oops out. So what would happen? What would be if someone picked up an object on Shabbat with the intent of throwing it, right? I pick up pick your ball, right? I've got a ball in my hand and it's Shabbos. And I'm just gonna throw it. I'm just, standing in my patio and I just want to throw the ball. It's just want to throw the ball. So what would happen if someone picked it up? Now I'm unsure. When I go to throw this ball, I'm planning for it to stay in my patio, but maybe it's going to bounce and go over the wall. Maybe it's going to go somewhere. I can't be 100% sure. Balls are balls. They do things. So if I'm unsure that the act of throwing will result in a violation of Shabbat or not, right? There's a possibility that the object will hit an apple and cause the apple to fall off the tree, right? And that's that's plucking an apple, harvesting an apple. That's a prohibited Shabbat labor, right? You can do it on Friday, you can do it on Sunday. You can't do it Friday night to Saturday night. And the ball might cause it to happen. So does that mean I shouldn't throw the ball because there's a possibility it might knock an apple down? Well, or there's a possibility the object will fly into the public domain. It's carrying from one domain to another is another prohibited action. So like I said, I throw the ball, it might bounce on the patio and then go over the wall and out of the domain, and now it's ended up causing something which is a transgression. So does that mean I just shouldn't throw the ball? No. As it says, he has no intention of violating these prohibitions, but is aware that the possibility exists, but we would permit him to throw would we permit him to throw the object or not? The answer is yes. We would permit someone to throw a ball in their patio on Shabbat, no problem. Even though the possibility exists, even though he is aware of the possibility that by throwing the ball something may inadvertently happen that would transgress Shabbat. He's not trying to do it. He's not aiming at the apple. He's not trying to throw it over the wall. But there's always an outside chance that something might happen. He is nevertheless still allowed to throw the ball. We all clear on that? Why? Because this is a matter of devar she'eno mitkaven, a matter that is not intended. Right? I wasn't trying to pick the apple. So therefore, I can't be held responsible for having picked the apple. That's not a transgression for the apple to have been picked by the ball that I threw, because I wasn't trying to pick the apple with the ball. It just happened. And even though I knew it might happen, at 0.0001% chance of happening, I'm still not responsible for it happening because it certainly wasn't what I was trying to cause to happen.
I think we need to spend many, many weeks on this. We're going to have an hour together
Yeah,
afterwards.
and we'll talk more about the this principle.
But
This is very nice, excuse me, this is very nice because if you had to stop it, you have to sit still on Shabbat and not move.
God forbid anything should happen.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah.
that's not a bad idea.
Well, we can talk about that in another class when we talk more about Shabbat. But
That's, as Rabbi knows, that's what I've been doing for many, many, many
but hold on,
years.
let's back up here to
But
our current
I have
focus.
to ask this for mutual interest.
Yeah.
Rabbi Avigdor Nebenzal, is
Yeah.
there general rabbinical agreement about this? Because
Yes.
I got to tell you,
This is his text. This is his text
I
of
think you should
explanation.
be careful with everything.
But the main principle that he is
Sabbath.
expounding here is commonly held by every rabbinical authority, which is that a devar she'eno mitkaven, an act that occurred that was not intended, you are not considered liable for on Shabbos. And in general, you're not considered liable for in many other ways unless it could have been easily foreseen or prevented. But we're going to have our anti-oops case in the second paragraph, so
How do you
hold
say
on.
oops in Yiddish?
Siddish do,
Huh?
Besuch nicht oops.
What?
Siddish do, Besuch nicht.
What?
I'll talk to you after class.
Yeah, sure. Okay,
I have
so.
to learn it. In Russian we say, oh, oh.
So he is permitted to throw the object in spite of the great likelihood even that a violation of Shabbat will result, simply because his intent is not to desecrate Shabbat. I'm not throwing the ball in order to desecrate the Shabbat. I'm throwing the ball because I want to throw the ball, and there's a chance that it might desecrate. Then that desecration doesn't count as desecration. Got it? Good. Would we apply the same principle to murder? Would the halakha permit me to throw an object while fully aware that the possibility existed that it may hit my fellow man standing nearby and kill them? Certainly not. Right? This is like classic example. If I'm in the middle of a New Year's Day celebration and I take out my gun and I shoot it in the air, can I say, hey, I'm not trying to shoot anybody. I'm just going bang, bang, bang. And therefore, if my bang, bang, bang comes down and people are dead, 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 I shouldn't be responsible because I wasn't trying to hurt them. Is that true? Is that a good excuse? No. It's not a good excuse in American law. It's not a good excuse in Jewish law. Right? And you can't just say, hey, devar she'eno mitkaven, I wasn't trying to do it, so I don't get, I'm not in trouble. No, for murder, you are absolutely in trouble. If throwing the object would in fact kill another, we would view this act as not far below intentional murder, God forbid. It's like, okay, fine, you weren't actually aiming at him, but your action was so obviously prone to lethality that you may not have been a deliberate murderer, but this is not just a case of I knocked the brick off the roof with my elbow. This is something much more serious. So, did you know that he was standing in the path? These are the questions you would ask. What right then did you have to throw the object if there was even the slightest chance that it would kill him? Remember, for Shabbos, even if there's an outside chance it might pluck the apple, I can still throw the ball. But here, if there's even a slim chance that it might kill another person, I certainly wouldn't do it. And I wouldn't be exonerated if I chose to do it. Right? Even exiling him to a city of refuge would offer him no protection, and the avenger of blood would still be permitted to kill him, even within its borders. Right? So let's make sure we understand that. If you are an intentional murderer, or it's not of a excused accidental category, but it's the case of gross criminal negligence, as in modern English, the avenger still can come and get you even here. Because that's not protected by the Torah. You got that?
If that brick had been a piano,
If the brick had been a piano and you were lifting it, with a fishing line, and someone was walking underneath it, and you didn't warn them or use better cables or something, then absolutely you are more liable. Well, you're not actually a murderer in the sense of being executed, but you would certainly be open to vengeance by the relative. And it's a weird gray zone where it's a culpable negligence that allows you to be killed by the avenger, but not killed by the court. And you're not going to be protected.
That's similar to building a rail around the top of your roof,
Absolutely.
covering a hole,
Absolutely, right. There's certain basic,
dangerous animals.
exactly, basic protective measures that are expected for dangerous situations, and for which we are responsible if someone hurts themselves or, God forbid, is killed. We can't just say they should have been more careful. we needed to take certain precautionary steps, follow certain Torah regulations, so that the blood is not on our hands. Okay.
I'm glad you made. I have to share something with everybody. I don't know if anybody else is a gun person. I'm a gun guy. Okay, I know how to use guns. My great-grandfather was killed in an accident. Someone shot a gun vertically at a New Year's celebration. For everybody's information, that bullet, when it comes down, it can kill.
Right. It's
Next time
absolutely.
you're invited to a Pashtun wedding,
And in fact, there's a wonderful Mythbusters episode about this, where they test all of this. And they did find that, yes, if you fire a bullet exactly perpendicular to the force of gravity, that if it's going straight up, and then, yes, it will come up to a stop and it will fall back at terminal velocity. But as long as you have even, a slight degree off, that it will maintain its ballistic trajectory and it will come back down with lethal force. So it's not something you want to fool around with. All right, but we've only got a few minutes left, so let's see if we can't move on to the second major issue, which is, okay, there's no oops for this, so that's why the guy, even if he did this accidentally, right, even if this was accidental, is being stuck here. But what about this high priest thing? What about the get out of the city of refuge when the high priest dies? What a strange way to limit the time that you're there. I mean, we could think, okay, maybe it's got to be there 5 years, or be there till the sabbatical, because the sabbatical releases things, or the Jubilee, even, which is a bigger release, and everyone has to go back to their land anyway. We could understand if there was going to be a more fixed time that the person could sit and wait and count for their sentence, for their punishment, however you want to look at this. But the death of the high priest? How random. I mean, so if the high priest dies the day after I'm here, then I'm out with 1 day, and if the high priest goes for another 30 years, I'm stuck here 30 years? Is that fair? Okay, so we got a number of different interpretations of why the high priest is dragged into this point. So the first is from Yerushalmi in Yoma is very straightforward. Just as Yom Kippur atones for all Israel, the deaths of the righteous atone for all Israel. That the death of the Kohen Gadol is atonement. And his death wipes the slate clean for the person who caused the accidental death, and therefore no more guilt remains. Don't like that?
Not really.
No, we're not a big fan. There are some of these themes within Judaism of one person's death atoning for another transgression. It's not a popular theme, and it really became a lot less popular after Christianity because of the way they ran with it. But it is there, and it is an explanation that's been used. But as I said, it's not one that most people find compelling. So let's try another one. For the Kohen Gadol causes the divine presence to rest upon Israel, and thus prolong their lives, whereas the murderers cause the divine presence to withdraw from Israel, and thus shorten their lives. Even someone who kills accidentally has shortened the life of Israel, which is the opposite of the Kohen Gadol's job. Right? The Kohen Gadol's main job is to try and help the people of Israel, and someone who has killed even accidentally has hurt Israel. Therefore, he is not worthy of standing before the Kohen Gadol. So you have to wait until the Kohen Gadol is dead before you can go free, because you were the opposite of him. So how could you possibly roam the country free while you are carrying what was the opposite of his calling? Not seeing a lot of support for that idea either. No, it's too personal, too much on the Kohen Gadol. Yeah, maybe.
I mean, we're assuming that he's really, really at least as cool as you are.
Well, I don't know if he was quite as snazzy, but
Snazzy dress.
but yeah, it does seem to be a little.
I mean, I trust you. I would trust you, but I wouldn't trust most other rabbis I've known.
And if your freedom was contingent upon my death, what would the result be of that relationship then? You think that might hurt our relationship a little bit? right? If someone was the prison chaplain and the prisoners knew that when the chaplain died, they'd get out of free, that the relationship might be strained.
Yes, I think right.
And indeed, which is why the next text is so heartfelt. It comes from the Mishnah, and it says the mothers of the priests, the mothers of the Kohanim, provide food and clothing for those who are in the cities of refuge. Why? So that they will not pray that their sons will die. Think of the compassion there, right? I know that you're stuck here until my boy dies. And I know that that's going to change how you look at him. Not even anything personal, but you're just hoping that he dies so you can go free. So I am going to show you compassion and help so that you won't pray for his death. I'm going to make your life here as comfortable as possible so you don't resent him for where you are. Interesting way to turn that around.
Well, yeah, if you like your rabbi, if you like your priest.
But there's an underlying problem here.
If I made this kind of mistake, I would want to be in your presence continually.
Yeah, well,
and I would not want you to die.
yeah, but if I was the limit to your freedom, that might change over a few years. You might be going, when is this guy gonna die?
Screw my freedom.
You know, here, eat some more
I'm not
fatty
such an
foods.
idiot that I think my
Have you ever
freedom
thought of
is
taking up
important.
smoking? It's it might change over time, and certainly, you know, over time in confinement, people have that reaction. But there's a problem here. Are really the prayers of the prisoner that the high priest die going to be answered by God? Right? Why should the mothers of the Kohanim be worried that these guys who cause accidental deaths, that their prayers will succeed in persuading God to kill the Kohanim? Really? Is that how God works? That if they
Really praying to him, though, you know.
well, exactly. So what power do they have that they need to bribe them with food and with clothing? Well, why should they bother? It's like, well, you know, the prayers of the evil we don't have to worry about, and the prayers of people who have no justification we don't have to worry about. Which is why what the Bavli brings next is so surprising. If they said such prayers, would the sons, the high priest, then die? They asked the question that I just elaborated on. But has it not been written, as the flitting bird, as the flying swallow, so the curse that has no cause will not come about? It's like, you know, fine, go ahead and, you know, curse me all you want from your city of refuge. Say, ooh, I hope he dies, I hope he dies. It's not going to happen. I mean, if evil people throw out curses, we don't need to worry about them because no one's going to listen to their curses, and certainly not God. But only if it has no cause can we count on it not coming true. A certain elder said, I heard from Rabbah, one of the great sages, the following explanations. They, meaning the Kohen Gadol, meaning the priests, ought to have sought mercy for their generation, and they did not do so. Meaning, if the Kohen Gadol had done his job properly, then the accidental death wouldn't have occurred. Therefore, the person who is here may indeed have some reason to have cause, legal cause, to blame the Kohen Gadol for not properly protecting the nation from his accidental crime. Following the logic here?
Yeah,
Right?
I'm
The
thinking of playing basketball on Saturday, and you know, basketball can be a dangerous sport.
And if the Kohen Gadol has not been attentive to the people of the nation, if the Kohen Gadol has not been fulfilling his duty as teacher, as peacemaker, as the spiritual inspiration for the people, the belief was that the people would suffer more accidental problems than not. I mean, can we believe that the spiritual leader of an entire country would bear some guilt if they were neglecting their duties? I mean, how much guilt do we hold for the Crusades? How much guilt do we put on the Pope? The Pope never swung a sword. And he never actually went and killed the Jewish communities or the innocents throughout the world that the Crusaders killed. But he inspired them to. And successive popes continued to inspire, or at least not dissuade those who wanted to do. don't we believe that the papal hierarchy bears some responsibilities for those deaths? And if one of the crusaders was caught while trying to commit an atrocity and was executed, couldn't we imagine that that crusader would say, "Ah, that pope, I'm only here because of what he did"? Now, we wouldn't exonerate him, but wouldn't we believe that his curse against his spiritual leader might have some legs to it, as opposed to the curse of some random murderer that was acting entirely of their own choosing? Perhaps, maybe. It's not quite so far-fetched.
Well, this man who's in the city of refuge, there's no reason to believe that he isn't a righteous man.
Absolutely. Righteous people can make oops.
And the prayers of a righteous man are heard.
And we would hope that they wouldn't be heard to the I speak English,
Yeah.
for the inappropriate damage of another righteous person. But the question would be here, was the Kohen Gadol fully righteous? And is the accident that happened symbolic of a problem within the society? Can we create a society that reduces the amount of deadly oops in our midst? And if we don't, are we not responsible? Not directly, we're not going to receive the same punishment as someone who has done it, but would we not bear part of the burden of guilt for having allowed more of the deadly oops to happen than should have happened? I know we like to focus on our individual responsibilities and our individual obligations and our individual transgressions, but Judaism also holds out that we are part of a linked network, of a community where the actions and intentions of each and every person does have a cumulative effect. And although we can't hold the high priest responsible for the inadvertent death, certainly there is a spiritual tension that is involved here. Maybe? Little?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to finish with Rambam, because it's always good to finish with Rambam, from Moreh Nevuchim, from his Guide for the Perplexed.
Yeah.
The accidental killer is exiled to calm the soul of the blood relative. Right? Why stick him in here? So it will calm the blood of the relative, such that he does not see the one via whom the mishap recurred. Right? Just imagine the problem if it's your neighbor who killed your dad, dropped a brick on his head accidentally. Every day you have to see him, walk into the store, he gets to go to the store, he gets to be with his family, he gets to do all the normal stuff. The anger, the pain is just going to continue to bubble and boil. Whereas if he goes and hides here, then I'm not going to see it. It's not going to be opening the wound day after day after day. So why then the high priest? And his return is predicated upon the death of the Kohen Gadol, for this is a natural matter for humans, that anyone whom misfortune falls, when it impacts one like him, or one greater than him, he finds comfort on what happened to him. And there is no greater occurrence of death by us than the death of the Kohen Gadol. So when the Kohen Gadol dies, I feel better that my father died, because I recognize his death is also a great loss, and I feel better about my loss when someone else also loses. Now, Rambam isn't saying that's like a wonderful, laudable feeling, but don't people often react that way? That if there is another death or a loss that is similar to, or happens to someone similar to themselves, or even greater, that we feel better about ours? If someone loses their job, don't they feel a little better when their boss gets fired too? If someone has, their new car get dinged, don't they feel a little better when they see some guy in a Ferrari, back into a telephone pole?
Oh, come on.
I'm not saying these are appropriate and laudable emotions, but many people do have that, and they have for at least as far back as Rambam, which is 1,000 years. And I think just to bring it into the modern day affairs, we still see this attitude day in, day out with some of the criticisms we hear about Israel right now. Do we not imagine that if the casualties were reversed, that Israel would have a little more sympathy? It's disgusting. Well, from some, yes. Remember, from some, yes. It's disgusting to imagine, but people are often persuaded purely by the loss of life, not by the cause of the death.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what's happening for the avenger that's here, who sees only the loss of their father or other relative, and doesn't realize that it's, or doesn't want to admit that it's just, in that case, an oops. They just see the death. And they would like another death to make them feel better about the death that they've had. And unfortunately, there are many people, trust me, from the discussion boards that I've been reading from people who are not unconditional supporters of Israel, to put it mildly, many of them who are not actual anti-Semites, the main argument they have against Israel is Israel must be bad because she hasn't had as many casualties. That's their argument.
Where do people
You've got
get their
hundreds dead on
brains?
this side,
Jeez.
you've got tens of deads on this
Right.
side, therefore the tens of dead side must be the worst side. And if there were more dead, I believe that there are many people, more dead on Israel's side, who would feel better for Israel. It's twisted. It's twisted. Oh, many would still think the same thing, absolutely. Many of them would just simply rejoice that there were more dead Israelis.
And as you said earlier, the rules for war are different than.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, many of the people, when we talked about this at the Nutshell a couple of weeks ago, many of the people who are not supporters of Israel are not actual haters of Israel or of Jews. They're just very uninformed and very superficial in their analysis of the situation. And we have to make sure that we understand that they're not hating us, they're just ignorant. In many cases, willfully ignorant, because they never bothered to read more than a headline, but just ignorant.
And they watch the news.
And they watch the news, which is, let's be honest, more commercials than news.
Oh, and they go on the internet where they get all sorts of lies.
And then from the internet, exactly, it's completely
Russia and Hamas
Yeah.
are putting out so many lies.
Absolutely.
Russia and Hamas are working together.
Of course.
I know
So,
it. We're going to prove it. And
so hold on a second. So unfortunately, and to get back to our personal state rather than just the state of Israel, unfortunately there are these tendencies within us to structure our understanding around of the world around us and of our own grief in a very relative sense, and often in a very superficial sense. And Judaism calls us to do better than that. Judaism calls us to recognize the true depth of the loss of life, even when it was accidental or unintentional. Judaism also calls us to recognize that additional death will not make the first loss of life better, and that the only thing that can bring peace to a community is true peace as the goal and justice. And that should continue to be in our prayers and in our hearts, not just for Israel, but for all of us in our own lives and personal endeavors as well. Thank you so much.
Last night, Fox News